What an honor to be able to speak with you all today with the one and only Molly Crabapple. I'm sure for many of you, as for me, Molly has been an incredible inspiration through her art and her activism. And I can't wait to get to y'all's questions. I'm sure you have very many. Molly, would you like to kick us off?
Does it work? How about now? Fuck yes. I just want to, before I start, I just want to say how profoundly grateful I am to be here in New Orleans, speaking with you all, speaking with a room of rebels and organizers and fighters for a better and more beautiful tomorrow, and how full my heart is to be speaking in the John Thompson Legacy Center and to be with the amazing fighters of JVP and Freedom Forum as well, so thank you. And also I want to thank Emily for stepping in. It is never easy to be a pitch hitter at the last minute. I've done it myself, and to have someone so quick and brilliant for it, I'm very grateful. And I'm going to start with a reading. During his elder years, my great-grandfather, the post-impressionist artist Sam Rothbard, tried to paint back into existence the murdered world of his shtetl childhood. Amidst the hundreds of watercolors that he called memory paintings, one stood out. A girl silhouetted against some cottages, her dress the same color as the crepuscular sky above. A moment before, she'd hurled a rock through one now shattered cottage window. On the painting's margin, her boyfriend offers more rocks. "Itka the Bundist breaking windows," Sam captioned the work. I may have been 15, 17, or 20 when I saw the watercolor in my great-aunt's sun-baked living room or my mother's apartment. I don't recall exactly. What sticks with me is the old-world awkwardness of the heroine's name, Itka. I turned the Yiddish syllables on my tongue. And Bundist, what was that? This question became the thread that led me to the Bund, a revolutionary society of which my great-grandfather had been a member, whose story was interwoven with the agonies and triumphs of Jews in Eastern Europe, and whose name has all but been erased. But this thread did not merely draw me back into a vanished past. It became a guide for our moment, in all its horror and possibility, in all its repression, courage, and loss. Founded in 1897 in the city of Vilna in the Russian Empire, and reaching its height in interwar Poland, the Bund was a sometimes clandestine political party whose tenets were humane, socialist, secular, and defiantly Jewish. Bundists fought the Tsar, battled pogroms, exalted the Yiddish language, and built vast networks of political and cultural institutions out of little more than love and grit. Seeking to liberate Jews from the poverty and violence of interwar Poland, they raised their children on the radical ethos of working-class solidarity and subaltern pride. Ultimately, these youth helped lead the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. Though the Bund was largely obliterated by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the group's opposition to Zionism better explains their absence from current consciousness. Though the Bund celebrated Eastern European Jews as a people, they irreconcilably opposed the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The diaspora was home, the Bund argued. Jews could never escape their problems by the dispossession of others. Instead, Bundists created the doctrine of Deutschheit, here-ness. Jews had the right to live in freedom and dignity wherever it was they stood. They would fight for a better and more beautiful world, even alongside people they had been raised to view as their enemies. The more I dug into the Bundist past, the more I realized it was not past at all. It was rather a candle to illuminate the tumultuous present. Despite war, state collapse, and genocidal repression, the Bund fought for the very multiracial democratic socialism that a new generation now champions at the ballot box. The Bundists built alternate worlds of beauty, of courage, and of hope, which allowed their people to persevere even in the midst of the apocalypse. Their ideas are still vital today. The Bund was a Jewish group, but its history is not for Jews alone. It belongs to all of us who believe in the necessity of human solidarity. In the story of the Bund, across decades and geographies, ages and faiths, I found the story of our own time, a blueprint for survival, a cautionary tale of death, and a philosophy that might yet save us.
And the many justice struggles that people across the United States and around the world take up. Can you talk to us about how you first became politicized and any through line that you might see across the scope of your work?
Thank you. Well, I grew up in a good Marxist home. That's the that's the answer. My father is Puerto Rican. He is a Puerto Rican independentista. As I'm sure most people in the room know, Puerto Rico was a colony of America. And I must have been 6 years old when he explained surplus value to me. He did it. I mean, he's like, Linita, why does this glass cost what it does? And I said, because of the sand in the glass? And he's like, no, man. This glass cost that much because someone had to dig up that sand, and someone else had to melt it, and someone else had to mold it, and then someone else had to put that cup on a truck and take it to a store, and someone else had to sell it, right? The value is, it's human life. That's what gives it the value. But the boss can never pay those workers as much as he has extracted from them, because if he did, he wouldn't make a profit. And so what capitalism is, it's the theft of human life. And I'm like, thanks, Padre. But I always had a sort of dual nature to my career, right? Emily gave this very beautiful explanation of my political work, but I actually got my professional start as an artist chronicling the burlesque world of New York City. I was obsessed with Toulouse-Lautrec since I was 4. I also am a short person who would like to get drunk and hang out with hot girls wearing petticoats. And when I was in my early 20s, the burlesque scene was exploding in New York, and I became a dancer, not out of any talent at all, I had none, but out of a desire to hang out backstage with these women as tough and hard and glamorous as diamonds. And I became the house artist for a depraved nightclub called The Box, which was known as the sort of place where the people who wreck our economy blow $10,000 a night on champagne. And I made their symbol pigs snorting coke while the dancers, my friends, towered like goddesses. And I think that when I try to summarize my work, I summarize that attraction to the intensities of life, to the beautiful girls lugging their drag bag on the subway on a frigid winter day so that they could change in the kitchen of a dive bar and transform into being a goddess. But also an obsession with the protesters, with the fighters, with the taxi workers who are on a hunger strike to the death so they can get out of debt servitude, with prisoners like the brilliant and since passed and dearly mourned Carrington Keyes, who organized with other men incarcerated in solitary confinement in Pennsylvania to protest against the torture that was being done by the guards with whatever means he had. I would travel to war zones like Ukraine, recently under the Russian invasion, also to Gaza in 2015, to the refugee camps in Greece, to the border when Trump was ripping families apart. And I would try to use my sketch pad the way that a photojournalist would use their camera. I would try to draw as fast and as true as I could in the same way that I learned in those nightclub stages. Because a nightclub is not so different to draw from than a protest. You're being jostled and working in adverse conditions. And one of the things about my work is I've always rejected the division that's foisted upon us, that there's the woman's world, which is frivolous and silly and is concerned with sex and beauty, and then there's the man's world, which is serious and is concerned with power and violence and politics. I always rejected that, and I think we only have one world, and I find life too short and precious to ever confine myself to one thing. But I think if I have one thing that I always do love to draw, it's a smart fighter.
I would want to clap too. So Molly, I really appreciate you grounding us today where your book begins the tale, and where I think your journey began with this particular subject, your great-grandfather's painting of Itke the Bundist. It can't get more personal and more visceral than that kind of sense memory created by your own family and the mystery that you chase as a result. Can you talk to us about how this very personal piece of art became a research process and a research project that has become this extraordinary book?
Thank you. Well, I grew up obsessed with my great-grandfather. And that might sound a little strange because, it's a long time ago. He died long before I was born. But Sam Rothbard was a painter, and he taught my mother how to paint, and my mom taught me how to paint. And so because of that, I always felt that the very fact that I could be an artist was a kind of ancestral gift from him. And I also grew up surrounded by him, by his paintings, his sculptures, by the photos of him hanging from his ankles from a chin-up bar when he was in his 80s, or eating fire, by the scraps of paper where he would write affirmations like, reject spineless authority, and without art, you're dead. And the stories about him, too. I learned that he was a moral vegetarian at a time when that wasn't really a thing, and he tried to set up a no-kill egg farm. But if anyone has ever done some egg farming, you know that the problem with this is you get a lot of homicidal roosters. And so he had my great-grandmother keep them apart while he wrote poetry about the glories of pacifism. And the body of work that painting, Itke the Bundist, comes from, these are all of his memories from Volkovisk, which was a small town in Belarus that he left behind in 1904. And I think that I was very influenced by these paintings because they were like this almost journalistic view of the town and of like every aspect. So he would have himself as like a bad kid drawing mean pictures of his rabbi in religious school, and then his rabbi beating his ass. He would have himself spying on the women in the bathhouse. He would have scenes of the market days, of pogroms, of violence, of life and fun and everything. And the painting of Itke, the reason that it so obsessed me was everything that I thought I knew about a young woman in 1898 in the Tsarist Empire in a small town said that she would not be throwing a rock through a window. Everything. And so I thought that the secret of why she was throwing that rock through the window had to have been contained in the word Bundist, because that was the only thing that could explain it to me. And so I started researching. And when I say researching, I want to make clear that by researching early on, I mean getting drunk and Googling. Who here does that? Is that relatable? People. And I was like, wow, they're so cool. And then, but it was just sort of like a casual thing. And then when it was 2015, I had the real honor of getting to be a guest of the Palestine Festival of Literature, which is an amazing, amazing program where they take writers and you do events all around like the West Bank and East Jerusalem where they pair you with local Palestinian writers, and it's this amazing like means of cultural exchange. And anyone who's ever been to Palestine knows that when you actually go there, when you actually see not just like the profound beauty and wit and sarcasm of Palestinian people, but also when you see the fucking horrors of apartheid, the violent, brutal, and just profoundly Walmart-ass ugly nature of the apartheid state, you get really angry and you get really disgusted. I don't think there's any other human reaction to being confronted with, the reality of like what Israeli apartheid looks like, except that anger and disgust. And so, I held that with me, and I especially held that because I went to Gaza in 2015, and I made friends there, and I, felt the profound prison-like smallness of the place, and even like there was shelling when I was there, and I was just so fucking disgusted with Israel. And so one night after I'd come back, I was drunkenly Googling again, as I spend my time, and I learned that the Bund was anti-Zionist. And I was like, fuck, this movement? It's not just socialists, it's not just like young troublemakers like my great-grandfather. They're anti-Zionist too, and that early. And so I got obsessed and I started reading every single book that I could about the Bund. I read every single memoir, every single academic text I could lay my hands on in the languages I knew at the time that I could read in, which was like Spanish, French, and English. And I wrote an article for the New York Review of Books about the history of this party that had, for the first 50 years of the 20th century, fought for the right of Jewish workers to stay in the lands where they lived in defiance of governments that wanted them dead, a party that had built schools, labor unions, a women's movement, armed militias, and a party that had vehemently opposed Zionism as a capitulation to European racists. And I wrote this piece, and it was the most popular thing I had ever done. I still get sometimes people stop me on the street over this piece. But more important than that, elderly people who were descendants of Bundists started to get in touch with me. People like the amazing pioneering lesbian poet Irena Klepfich, whose father, Mikhail, was the bomb maker in the Warsaw Ghetto. People like the great union leader Mark Ehrlich, whose grandfather, Henrik Ehrlich, led the Bund in Poland. And they came to me with stories. And the more I listened to these amazing elders, the more I realized that I wasn't done with writing about the Bund. This was not something to just like stick away, in one article, the way that journalists do. Journalists, they're like the intellectual fuckboys of the world. They have a really intense fling and then they bam, and they ghost. I was like, no, we're getting married. And the first thing that I needed to do in order to do this was I needed to learn to speak to the dead. Because just like you can't be going to report in Mexico City without knowing Spanish, you can't be going to write about your rebel dead without knowing their language. And their language is Yiddish, the language of the Jewish working class in Eastern Europe. And so I studied Yiddish for 2 years. I got the most dense and boring socialist texts ever written in Yiddish, the Geschichte von Bund and the Deures Bundesten, and I translated those fuckers. I read every single book that I could in Yiddish about the movement. I ended up going to Ukraine, to Poland, to Latvia, to Lithuania. I had letters, I had diaries, I had women's memoirs, which were way funnier than the men's memoirs and way smarter. And I didn't just read the work of Bundists, because I'm sure we all know, all of us who are involved in movements, that we're not always like honest about ourselves and our perfection. So I also read the work of the Bundists' enemies too. And I threw myself into old newspapers to get the texture of life in big city mafia-ridden in Warsaw between the wars, or in New York at the turn of the century in the teeming Lower East Side. And I wrote until I had 1,000 fucking pages, and then I cut them because I can't inflict that on anyone else. And this book has been a sort of act of necromancy and of reclamation. And the more that I researched the Bund, the more I realized that not only had they been physically, violently, murderously erased by Nazism and by Stalinism, but they had also been deliberately culturally erased by Zionism. Zionists had always hated Bundists. They had always beefed with them. David Ben-Gurion in Qansk, his hometown, has an anecdote where he loses an argument to a Bundist because of his annoying, squeaky voice and pulls out a gun and screams, "We have weapons and we'll shoot you down with animals." This is a prefiguration to what will come later. And because Zionists and Bundists had always had this huge mutual hatred, and because the Bundists had been such astute critics of Zionism since the very early days, and they had always seen the fascism implicit in Zionism, as Zionism gained hegemony in the Jewish community, it sought to erase the Bund, just as it did other more liberatory aspects of the Jewish past.
Thank you, Molly. When you see me on my phone, it's actively coordinating this event because it's a moving picture, okay, just to clarify. I want to lift up something that you just said that I felt pop in this room. Not that you probably, I don't think you need further affirmation for how important this book is, but let me just ask the question, because I felt it. Is there anybody in here, please by a show of hands, who related to that when Molly said they have felt the violent erasure of this history, i.e. our history, through Zionism? Does anybody have a personal experience that connects to that? Yeah? Okay. Just to clarify, like, yes, this is what one of the many things your book is delivering on. At least I'll just speak from the I. Something that I have suspected for a long time and has been confirmed in whispers of my memory that you have made real and you have put onto the New York Times bestseller list. And so I am so grateful to you for that, truly. Thank you. Okay, I want to get to, did anybody come here with something they want to ask Molly Crabapple? Nobody has any question? I'm going to ask another, but I just want to, I think we got a lot of questions in this room. And again, knowing a lot of these folks, they're going to be great questions. So I want to get to you, but I get to ask my dream question right now. I'm sure everybody in this room can pinpoint that contribution you have made, that they're just like, man, Molly Crabapple, like really. I want to ask you about mine. The thing that you introduced me to that I did not know I desperately needed was when you connected two concepts that are for me guiding principles in how I engage in justice work. Those concepts, which I never even thought to connect before, and then you did it, and I was like, obviously. Those concepts are Doigkeit and Samud. Can you share with us your understanding of Doigkeit and Samud and the relationship you see between the two?
Thank you. Before I talk about that, I just need to talk about how shit it was to be a Jew in the Russian Empire, because you can't really understand the defiance and the toughness implicit in Doigkeit until you understand what Jews were up against there. Jews in the Russian Empire and later in interwar Poland were a racialized minority. It was not just a matter of your religious belief. You were still considered a Jew if you were an atheist, if you were a Christian. In the Tsarist Empire, it said it on your passport. It determined where you could live, what jobs you could do. It made you liable for military conscription. That was 25 years. And as we all know, when a government targets a minority, that basically gives permission to every sociopathic bigot in the world to also target that minority. And so Jews in the Tsarist Empire and later in interwar Poland lived in an atmosphere where they were targets of violence. And there was an ideological underpinning to this, and that underpinning, especially in interwar Poland, was European ethno-nationalism. It was the idea that legitimate peoples have a state, and that state should be homogenous, and if you don't have a state that's all for your people and for no other people, then you're not a legitimate person. You're some sort of wandering cancer on the body politic of the healthy nation. And ethno-nationalism has always had a huge problem with diasporic people like Jews and also with Roma. It sees no place for them and usually seeks to expel them. And so Jews were not viewed, even if they had lived in Eastern Europe for 1,000 years, they were not viewed as part of that land by the majority societies. They were viewed by large swaths of Russian and Polish society as harmful foreigners that ought to dick off somewhere else. Maybe to Palestine, maybe somewhere else, but not here. Because they didn't belong here because this land was for pure, pure Russian or Polish Christians, thank you very much. And the young Jewish Marxists who found the Bund completely rejected that, and they said, this is our land. We were born here. Our fathers and grandfathers were born here. This land is soaked through with our blood, and we have a right to live here and the right to fight for that which belongs to us, for civil, political rights, and not just to be tolerated here like you tolerate a fucking bunion in your shoe, but to live beautiful, flourishing lives here with art and culture and poetry and sports and theater, to have dignity and to have freedom here. When Bundists said, here where we live is our country, which is the slogan that I took my book title from, it was both an affirmation of their belonging to the place, but also it had a huge defiance to it. It was saying, here where we live is our country, motherfucker. And if you don't like it, we have guns. And I connected Duikite to the Palestinian concept of samud, of steadfastness, which is this refusal to be evicted from your homes, from your land. This commitment to stay on the land that's yours despite all of the violence, all of the predations, and all of the horror of the Israeli state. It's a refusal to be uprooted by the bastards of history.
Thank you, Molly. For those of us who engage in Palestine solidarity work, particularly through an anti-Zionist frame, I think a lot of us often feel like we have to apologize for it. Whether we're Jewish or not, or whatever our point of entry, we have to apologize for it. And for me, the way you connect this extraordinary struggle you have chronicled in this book to the globally inspiring Palestinian commitment to steadfastness and a refusal to leave Palestinian land and an insistence on liberation and full dignity and humanity reminds me that none of us have to apologize for fighting for freedom for all peoples. So thank you for that, really. Is there anybody out here who might have a question for Molly Crabapple? Please.
I should first say I'm only a quarter of the way through the book, and it's an incredible read. I read a lot of history, and sometimes I push through history even when it's not super readable, but this is incredibly riveting. I'm interested in the question of language. You have three groups. Okay, I mean you have the Zionists who want to revive create a modern Hebrew language, and they want to create an ethno-state, and they're creating kind of a particularist Jewish language, and they're not interested in talking to the rest of the world, which is an idea I don't agree with, but it's coherent. Then you have the communists, like the Soviets, who are speaking in Russia, they're speaking Russian. In France, they're speaking French. Even if they're of ethnic Jewish background, like Trotsky, because they want to speak to their people. And then you have the Bundists, who are speaking about like kind of a universalistic revolution in Yiddish, which is a language that none of the non-Jewish people in the area understand. And it just seems like there's some tension there, and I just wanted you to kind of explain.
No, that's a fantastic question. So the Bund never only wrote in Yiddish. The Bund always had papers in Russian and in Polish. When they were in Argentina, they had it in Spanish as well. But I see it more as an assertion of dignity. Yiddish was a subaltern language. It was a language that was dismissed as jargon, was what it was called. It's actually a great line by Max Weinreich, who was the founder of YIVO, the Center for Eastern European Jewish History, where he says, a dialect is a language without a navy. And I think that there are many, many groups of people who have a language that is not backed by state power. And so and so doesn't have the resources of languages that are backed by state power. I think about my Kurdish friends in Turkey, for instance, who feel a fierce commitment to preserve their language that's dismissed and very often violently repressed as well. But that commitment to preserve minority languages, oppressed languages, languages that even might have been wiped out by genocide, isn't in opposition to internationalism. It's just a recognition that we can live in like diverse, multilingual, multicultural societies. I mean, in the Russian Empire, there were so many languages that were spoken. It was not, only Russian. And I mean, what a loss for the world it would be if those languages were wiped out in a sort of homogenizing drive, And I often remind myself, I'm like, all of human history, it wasn't a bunch of monolingual Americans. People were able to have the language of their people, Yiddish, Bukharian, Georgian, whatever it was, Kurdish, West Armenian, and also speak a common language.
Anyone else like to ask a question? Please.
You can decide how much of a tangent this is, but as far as I'm aware, Norman Finkelstein's from a Bundist family background. How much of that do you think motivated some of the animus towards him in terms of expelling from academia?
I mean, the animus towards Bundists far predates Norman Finkelstein's birth.
Well, sure. Otherwise, we wouldn't written the book yet.
I think the thing about the animus towards Bundists is one of the things that Zionism tries to do, like all ethno-nationalist and fascist movements, is it tries to colonize the entirety of its people's history, and it tries to claim that everyone who was Jewish was one way, they thought one way, that Zionism was the only thing that anyone thought, that it was the obvious thing, that it was inevitable. And with Zionism especially, one of the things that they try to do is they try to frame everything that happened between the Roman destruction of the temple thousands of years ago and the Nakba and creation of Israel in 1948 as nothing but a veil of ashes where weak Jews were humiliated and murdered, and then eventually they all were gassed. That's how Zionism treats the incredibly complicated and varied and sometimes painful, sometimes beautiful 2,000 years of Jewish diasporic history. And one of the other things that Zionism tries to do is it tries to create a dichotomy, which is that there are these weak Jews who were gassed and they were murdered because they were weak, and then there were the big, strong Israelis, bravely and strongly doing their war crimes. And that's your choice. You either are weak and you're murdered, or you're strong and you murder others. That's it. And I think that one of the real reasons that there's so much animus to the Bund so long after it was destroyed as a political organization is because the Bund shows both of those things are lies. It shows that Jewish history always had a massive diversity of opinions, but also Bundists were strong. They fought with guns, right? They fought with brass knuckles and with guns. When I think about who they're most analogous to, I always think of the Black Panther Party, right? Another group of young Marxists from a racialized minority who believed in both internationalist socialism and the beauty of their own people, and who set up vast networks of mutual aid, of education, of literary production, and who defended it all with the force of arms. I think that there's a great similarity between the Bund and the interwar Poland and the Black Panther Party in the US. And I think there's another third reason also that there's a lot of animus, and that's Bundists always had Zionists' number. There's this line from Henryk Ehrlich in 1938, he's leader of the Bund in Poland, where he writes, if a Jewish state should arise in Palestine, it will be at a state of eternal war with the external enemy, Arabs, a state of eternal struggle for every scrap of land against the internal enemy, Arabs, and a state of constant attempted extermination of the language and culture of the non-Hebraized Jews of Palestine. And then he asked, is this a climate in which freedom and democracy will grow? Is this not the climate in which reaction and chauvinism will flourish? And I think of everything, Zionists particularly can't forgive the Bundists for knowing exactly what they are.
Do you mind?
Yeah. talked a little bit about the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Uprising, and like, it was so beautiful. You were just talking about the complication of being in solidarity and then also being betrayed, and kind of what that made you think about Zionism as well. And I was wondering if you would share a little bit of that in this group.
Sure. Well, the Warsaw Ghetto, to describe it, you have to understand that Warsaw was the largest Jewish city in Europe and is the second largest Jewish city in the world. The Warsaw Ghetto was hundreds of thousands of people shoved into a very, very small area and starved for several years until they were murdered in Treblinka. And it was a full society. It contained opera singers and mafiosos. It contained people who were very religious and people who didn't believe in God at all, and even Jews who had converted to Christianity. It had a Catholic church in there. And it contained every to hate each other because people don't change who they are, even in the midst of the apocalypse. And the Zionists and Bundists continued their opposition to each other in the Warsaw Ghetto, including risking their lives to write newspapers where they denounced each other for not understanding Marx. And yeah, we always think like, well, shit gets so real that we will unite, and history has news for you. And the Warsaw Ghetto is in the center of Warsaw, right? It is, it's not somewhere far away. There are Polish people going on trams through the ghetto. Everyone knows what it is. And the Bund in the Warsaw Ghetto, they really put their faith in their sister party, which was the Polish Socialist Party. And this was a party that they had a long and sometimes fraught relationship with, but that they had fought fascists together with side by side. The Polish socialists, after the Nazi occupation, they made Bundists fake papers. Polish socialist couriers went to Auschwitz for distributing the Bundist press. They hid Bundist children, they hid Bundists in their homes. And the Bund saw their struggle as part of the struggle of all of Poland to liberate themselves from the Nazis. And they believed that, like, when they did an uprising, it would be an uprising to liberate Warsaw. Now, they also were constantly asking Polish socialists for guns in the ghetto, and the Polish socialists were not giving it to them. And why weren't the Polish socialists giving them guns? Because the Polish socialists were part of a body that was called the Polish Home Army, which was the largest and most powerful anti-Nazi resistance force that would ever exist in occupied Europe. It was massive and very effective. And the Polish Home Army didn't have any Jewish representation at all from its founding. And it also had a plan, and the plan was that while they would do sabotage, they would infect lice with typhoid and put it in Nazi shirt collars, for instance, or blow up train tracks. They would do stuff like that, but they wouldn't do direct confrontation with the Nazis until such a time as either the Russians or the Americans were close enough, and then they would do a massive uprising. And that would be the thing that would allow them to liberate Poland from the Nazis. And when the Germans decided to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto and to deport 90% of its inhabitants to Treblinka, the Russians were still in Stalingrad, and the Americans hadn't landed in Europe. And so the Polish Home Army did not do a big confrontation to try to save these Jews who are 1/3 of Warsaw, I want to make clear, and even criticize them for going to their deaths in their newspaper. And there was another group in the ghetto that was also contemplating, I mean, there were many groups in the ghetto that were contemplating armed revolt, but one group was, they were young Zionists, part of the leftist Zionist youth movement called Terror. It was two lovers, Yitzhak Zuckerman and Selina Lubetkin. And they were, I believe, the first people to suggest having a united Jewish armed combat group. And when they first suggested this, the Bund said no, because they didn't like Zionists, and also because they thought it was fucking stupid. They were like, you're going to do an uprising in the ghetto, you'll all be murdered. And then 90% of the ghetto was murdered. And the young people who were left, because most of the Bund's adult leadership was either murdered or was in hiding in the Aryan part of the city, the young people who were left decided they didn't really care about ideology anymore. And they made a united Jewish combat group, except they didn't allow in right-wing Zionists, because, you know, yeah, you gotta draw the line. But nonetheless, they made a united Jewish combat group of left-wing Zionists, communists, and Bundists. And they were given 50 guns by the Polish Home Army, and they had some more guns that they bought on the black market, and they had some light bulbs filled with battery acid, and some homemade Molotovs, and one homemade landmine. And with that, they held off the Nazi army for longer than the entire country of France. And it was the first urban revolt in occupied Europe. And one of the things that like when I went insane writing this book, I'm just gonna be honest with you, to write about a genocide in intense detail in the midst of another genocide going on currently, especially with people that I personally know in Gaza who are still there, this is a double vision that will drive anyone to being fucking nuts in the head, and I was deeply nuts in the head while I was writing this book and deeply in agony. But one of the things I just kept thinking about was that these Polish socialists, right, who were friends with Bundists, lovers of Bundists, right, sometimes married them, that they helped the Bundists. Some of them went to Auschwitz, some of them died helping Bundists, right? But that the solidarity at the end, it only went so far, and there was a line, and the line was that they, like the rest of the Home Army, refused to allow the uprising to spread to Aryan Warsaw because they knew that if the uprising spread, that Aryan Warsaw would be destroyed, and they basically wrote off the Jews as doomed and the Poles as not. And so they watched as their friends and their lovers and their comrades burned alive in the center of Warsaw. And there's an irony to this, which is that about a year later, the Red Army got to Praga, which was a suburb of Warsaw. It's right over the river. And they made broadcasts, illegal radio broadcasts, that said, Poles, rise up against the Nazis. And the Polish Home Army did rise up. This is what they were waiting for. And then the Red Army waited in Praga, and they did not intervene, and they allowed the Nazis to crush the revolt. And the reason that they did that was that Joseph Stalin didn't like the Home Army, and he was happy for them and the Nazis to kill each other off, saving him the trouble. And so just as the Warsaw Ghetto burned and Warsaw watched, Warsaw burned and the Red Army watched. Sorry, it has funny moments, but it's a grim book too. It is the history of the first half of the 20th century in Europe.
Before we get to the next question, I'm coming to you. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. So once the Q&A of this event wraps, Molly will be at the front signing books. If you haven't brought a book, Community Book Center will also be at the front selling books, and we'll have food at the back, all right? So that's kind of the order of events. Back to the question.
And I just want to make one more note, and then back to the questions. If you have extra bucks, I know a lot of us don't, but if you do, I highly encourage you to buy this book for someone in your life who is wrong and has bad opinions. Another question.
And admire how thoroughly you have learned this history. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to ask you, I hate to reduce things to this, but I know we should all read the book too, but could you maybe summarize your biggest takeaway of what you think the Bundist movement did that we can take with us now, the present, and the future? And also, if there's anything that you think was maybe a misstep or mistake that we can learn from and
these are great questions. So I'll start with the first big misstep. The Bund has several very key moments where they're in a political situation where they're dealing with motherfuckers on their own side. And usually, by this I'm talking about usually the Bolsheviks. And instead of staying in maybe a compromised, flawed political situation where they still had power and wielding that power, they flounced out of the room and left. And they did this in 1903 when they left the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Lenin essentially bullied them out. And they would do it in 1917 after the October Revolution when they leave the Second Congress of the Soviets. And it's really this tendency that they have, which I'm very sympathetic to, which is to stand on principle, but it leads to them ceding their power. And the more that I wrote this book, and the more that I wrote it, like while fascism is taking over America, like while immigrants are being herded into concentration camps here, and the people who are protesting to keep them out of concentration camps are being shot in the face, the more I realized that leftists cannot afford to flounce out of situations, that they must take power. You have to deal seriously with power. And the reason is that if you do not seriously contend for power, the people who take it will be the fascists, and they will shoot us in the fucking face. And so I just think that as leftists, we have to be very serious about power, and the Bund has some very cautionary tales about that. In terms of like what we could take from them, so there's a practical thing and there's a moral thing. The practical thing is that I love what the Bund built in interwar Poland, and what they built was they built a beautiful culture, and it was a culture that spoke to every single type of person, right? It wasn't just like theoretical journals and like newspapers that had like a really smart party line. It was that they had the most popular sports club in the country. They had a kids movement. It was like the Socialist Boy and Girl Scouts. They had choirs, they had dances. They had summer camps and whole programs for workers to explore the countryside in Poland, something that they hadn't like necessarily felt included in. They had a sanatorium that was the most beautiful part of their network that was like renowned all over the world, that was for slum kids at risk for tuberculosis. They had a militia that defended themselves. They had publishing houses. They had newspapers that wrote about socialism in China and that translated avant-garde literature into Yiddish. They had an ethos that appealed to everyone. I mean, I'm so sorry that Kali is sick. It was one of the things that I was so excited about, was I see so many parallels in like in Cooperation Jackson, right? And in building power in the cooperative economy. The Bund also believed in the cooperative economy. They had an amazing labor union movement, and that was like really their roots. And one of the things that I think is really important for the left to do is I think it needs to realize that there are all different types of people who are attracted to all different types of things, and they're all equally valid. Like there's nothing, you're not more valid for liking academic stuff than you are for wanting to lift weights. Like there are all sorts of ways to be fucking human in the world, and the left has to appeal to all sorts of people and speak to all of them in like their own language and idiom. And the Bund really, really excelled at that. So, and they built a culture that was so seductive that, you know, sometimes I would read these memoirs of these like Bundist 15-year-olds, and they're not like choosing which group to join because of Marxist analysis. They're choosing because of which one built a culture that they would see themselves in. And I often think, like I was talking with my friend Clayton over here, I think that we need to make a distinction between excluding people and repelling people.
Yeah.
And sometimes the left thinks that they're excluding people, but those people don't want to come in. They're actually repelling them. And I think that the Bund just shows what it's like to have an incredibly fucking cool culture. Another thing that I often think about, something that I really draw from, is it's a moral thing, it's not a practical one. And it's about solidarity across difference. Because what the Bund really believed at their heart is they believed that you could remain who you were, you could keep your language right, you could keep your culture, you could keep your religion, but you could fight with other people who were very different from you, even people who were from like the group that traditionally oppressed you, and that you could fight together for a better and more beautiful world. That they believed in solidarity that was across difference, and in fact was rooted in difference, that you did not have to all sublimate your individuality or particularities into majority culture. And the more I'm alive, the more I think that that sort of solidarity across difference is the only defense we have against savagery. It's the only thing that can save us.
I'm just going to point out that we're having this this conversation on a day where our capital in Baton Rouge saw Louisianans of every imaginable kind standing up and fighting back against our legislature for trying to take away our right to choose our own government. And this is also a day where our city council emphatically insisted that we will have the public officials that we elect, and that no governor, no attorney general, nobody else is going to get between us and our right to have the government that we elect. So in my view, the struggle that you are describing, this sort of solidarity across difference, this interracial, coalitional coming together for the world that we deserve, that's the fight that I think is breaking a lot of our hearts right now. And at the same time, we have these moments right now where we can take heart because we can do it. We're showing every day that we can do it. And so again, what an extraordinary contribution you've made to remind us the work we are carrying forward is historic, not just in this country, thinking back to the Civil Rights Movement, thinking back to Reconstruction, but also in these other communities in the world from which many of us ultimately have come. Thank you, really. I'm just gonna keep thanking Molly Crabapple.
Say, when you do a book like this, it involves being alone for a really long time and literally being hunched over like a gremlin over your little laptop like this in a room, becoming a freak that can't talk to people. So I'm deeply grateful to be speaking to other humans about my crazy passion project.
All right, more questions? Yes, please.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Bund's relationship to religion and faith. It seems like there's a world in which committed leftists, Marxists are not particularly interested in religion. But in your study of the Bund, are there instances where the Bund is able to find common ground with both Jewish people who are very religious and then maybe non-Jewish groups because they share similar causes?
That's a really great question. I think that this is an example of the practical, and because it's practical, sometimes contradictory attitudes of the Bund. The Bundist leaders were atheists, and not only were they atheists, they were kind of dicks about religion. For instance, it was a praxis to wheat paste posters on the walls of synagogues on Friday just after sunset, because no one could take them down until Saturday. They would serve ham sandwiches on Yom Kippur. They had their ways, right? But at the same time as, and they also put out a Saturday edition of Volkszeitung, which was their newspaper in interwar Poland, which led to giant street brawls with yeshiva students that took over entire city blocks, which led to a cherem. A cherem is like excommunication being put on all of the editors at Volkszeitung. So there was some beef, right? But I would also say that like any organization that's a working class organization, especially one rooted in the labor movement, tons of Bundists were very religious, obviously, because lots of working class people are very religious. And the Bund was very willing to throw down in defense of religious liberties, especially even, for instance, they didn't particularly care about kosher slaughter, but they knew that a ban against kosher slaughter was about the government being racist. It wasn't about the Polish government caring about animal cruelty in 1937. And so they would do a nationwide general strike to defend that. There was a story that I read from Lodz that I think summarizes a lot of the complexities of this, so there would be these racist Polish nationalist groups that would go to beat up religious Jews when they were coming out of synagogue on Saturday. And then the Bundists would wait with baseball bats to defend those Jews. And then the religious Jews coming out of synagogue would yell at the Bundists for holding baseball bats and desecrating Shabbos. Because you're not supposed to hold objects on Shabbos. So I think that shows a lot about contradictions.
Thank you.
I see you, Jacob.
I apologize for the long question, but thank you. And the Bundists built this identity around a Dorkite and being rooted in the place you you live. But for those of us in a diaspora now, that place has become complicated. And when I try to say where my family's from, which is probably where a lot of our families are from, that place like doesn't exist. And those borders have moved and those towns are gone. And even when we were there, like you said, we were not a part of the like national identity. And so when you went back, did writing this book like change how you think of where you're from, and like when you think of yourself as an American, in the way that the Bundists were proud to be from where they're from, like has your perspective shifted about where you come from now?
That's an awesome question. I mean, I'm going to speak like personally about my own experience, and like everyone's experience is so different on this, so I can only speak to mine. I've always considered myself a New Yorker, and it's because my family lived in New York for 120 years. My Jewish family, my Puerto Rican family, my dad came in the 1950s during Operation Bootstrap, which is when the U.S. government tried to encourage Puerto Ricans to come to the U.S. to do shitty factory jobs. But because I love New York so much, and because I have so much family history in it, and because I don't know, it's like in my blood, like in all the bad things about New York too. Like I'm not like idealizing New York. It's a really fucking hard city that seems to exist to like thwart and crush people. But nonetheless, it's where I'm from. For me, it wasn't complicated because I was from New York, and I've never felt like I'm from Belarus, and the town that my great-grandfather is from is basically everything that he painted except the chalk cliffs has been burned and destroyed. Like they tore up the graveyard and used the stones to reinforce a bridge, stuff like that. And in Puerto Rico, while I love Puerto Rico, and while I'm like, I would love to like visit my abuelos when I was a kid, and I'd love to go on road trips with my father there. I didn't grow up in Puerto Rico. Like I speak Spanish like a gringa, you know what I mean? Like I'm from Pafuera, and so I'm from New York, and I think that answer of where you're from and where home is going to be very, very different for everyone. But in some ways, I feel like lucky to have a little bit less complexity with myself.
Yeah, you've talked about the culture that the Bundists built and sort of what they stood for. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how they organized, how they tried to build power. And I also wondered if you could touch on how they responded and how they acted and tried to maintain their organization as Nazism closed in on them.
Thank you, Nathan. So their first unit of organizing were labor unions, right? It was before the Bund, the way that in Tsarist Russia, the way that revolutionaries thought things were going to work was they were like, these workers here in Tsarist Russia are really fucking dumb. And what we need to do is we need to have them all go to a bunch of book clubs. And then once they go to enough book clubs, they'll be smart and they can like tell the other workers to come to book clubs. And if we do this enough, revolution. And one of the innovations of the founders of the Bund, who had tried this, by the way, for like 5 years, they were not any quicker on the outtake than anyone else. They were like, I don't think this is going to work. I think the strategy, it's flawed. But there are workers that are already organizing themselves, right? They're already organizing labor unions, because workers are always organizing themselves. Workers don't need intellectuals to tell them that it sucks to be underpaid and abused at a job, right? And so these young Bundists, what they did was they were like, what can we add to these pre-existing movements? And they're like, well, we have some legal expertise, we have connections abroad, we have fundraising networks, right? So let's work with these unions and organize them into something more networked, more militant, bigger. And I think that everything else they did, like they had electoral programs, they ran people for M1 for like city councils around Poland, even the parliament in Latvia. They had militias, they had, during the revolution of 1905, they took over whole cities, But I think that really their fundamental basis was the labor union movement. And I think that that's because labor is the lever of power, right? Like labor is what turns the earth. It's like the inflection point. Now, in terms of how they kept their organization after the Nazi invasion, it's really interesting because I feel like when I would read stuff about the Holocaust when I was a kid, it was often like the stories of individuals or families, right? And I didn't read the story of like what would a leftist organization do if fascism took over their country. Like what do you do? Like you have comrades, you have illegal print shops, you have all these skills, like what do you do? And the Bund reconstituted as an underground organization 2 weeks after the Nazi takeover. And they would run vast networks of underground soup kitchens, of smuggling, printing and smuggling illegal newspapers, getting news into and out of the country. They would run like cooperative job workshops to try to like keep people out of the labor roundups. And inside the ghetto, they would keep up links with the Polish Socialist Party, which let them like not just get news in and out, but there was a Bundista named Zain Hashmat, who, with the help of the Polish Socialist Party, he discovered the truth about the Treblinka death camp, and they smuggled that report out as the first major Jewish report on the Holocaust was by the Bund. And essentially, they were able to keep up they were able to keep up their networks even after 90% of the ghetto had been liquidated. And I think that really shows something about them, which is that like, there are a lot of leftist groups that split a lot over theory, and I think sometimes the Bund, they could be like a little bit fuzzy about theory, and there's a reason like we're not necessarily like reading their theoretical texts. But the thing that they had instead of that was they had this like almost familial love for each other. And that loyalty, that like life or death loyalty, I think was one of the things that allowed them to keep up their networks and to avoid, betrayal in the most difficult possible circumstances.
Hi. To your point about organizing sometimes being figuring out what you have to offer to add to something that's already happening, I'm really fascinated by the fact that you do art and writing and a ton of historical research. And I was just wondering about how do you decide like what's going to be drawn, what's going to be prose, and did you have to take out some art because of the limitations of making a book?
Yeah, and I wanted to do like way more drawings, and my publisher was like, no one will fucking buy your book if it's that long. He was like, you're already pushing it. And I mean, with this story just couldn't be told just with visual art. It's just not it's not that type of story. Like there's a specificity, right? There's a real history. I don't know, I mean, for me, I guess it's intuitive, but I think that's probably because I've drawn for so long.
All right, can we have one more question? Yeah.
Oh, mine's a follow-up to that one. So I'm wondering if you could describe a bit more about your writing process, your routines, sort of what inspires you and keeps you going, even when it gets tough.
Well, I fucking hate writing, like I really do. I don't know why I've done this with my life. It's really easy for me to draw, and it's really hard to write. It's lonely, it's miserable, your back hurts. It really sucks, actually. And I think the thing is, I live in one room with my partner, and when you write, you're like a twitchy weirdo. When you hear someone breathe, you like can't write anymore, So I think the thing that really helped me was I got a fellowship at the New York Public Library where they gave me a room for 10 months, and just having that room and access to their collection was what carried me through, because dear God, if I had to continue sharing one room with my partner and listening to him play the game, I think I would have died. But yeah, I don't know, my process, I really like stimulants, and I just would write. I think the other thing is I would just like write everything in my head that I possibly could, and then I would cut it later. I believe that editing is the soul of writing. My first draft is like the worst shit in the world. No one would want that. And I think the other thing was that in this book, I'm not an academic. I don't have a college degree. I went to Fashion Institute of Technology, and I was not going to put on academic drag and pretend I was something that I wasn't. I decided to write the book as myself and to give myself freedom. I'm gonna end this with a reading, and that's because I get the last word because it's my event. And after the reading, I want to see all of you guys at that table back there. And as I said, like, buy books from people in your life who are wrong and have stupid opinions, because they can change them. Okay. Okay, they were right, one friend told me after he finished my manuscript. Right and dead. What's the big lesson you want us to take away from that? After all, the Bund failed. Lost, I answered, more sharply than I meant. What's the difference between that's a secret? I didn't just write this book out of scholarly devotion. I had a hidden hope. By studying the Bund story, I wanted to find out if there was some way that my people, the Jews of Eastern Europe, could have saved themselves. The more I wrote, the more I realized the wrongness of my premise. Though individuals escaped in various ways, there was no way out for Eastern European Jews as a collective, not as long as they were fighting alone. No small minority could have rescued themselves from the horrors of the 20th century. Despite astounding feats of heroism, cunning, and creativity, they couldn't hold Hitler back, nor the intractable hatred of so many of their Christian neighbors. The Bund could not change the balance of force. Neither could any other Jewish group in Eastern Europe, whether assimilationist or Zionist, capitalist or communist, Hasidic or Christian convert. 6 million scattered humans can't defeat vast armies of organized killers. The accusation of failure isn't one we should level against the Bund or any other Jewish group of that place or time. It's for the Western world, of which they were such a precarious part. It was the West, after all, that hypocritically paid lip service to freedom and humanity, while hewing to the crude doctrines of might. The true failures were the democracies who played nice with Hitler in the early years, then shut their doors to Jewish refugees who fled from the hell they helped enable. The failures were the British and American diplomats who hobnobbed in Bermuda while the Warsaw Ghetto burned. The Western world failed the Jews of Europe when they refused to provide the basic solidarity that the historical moment demanded, the solidarity upon which the Bund's humanism relied. This betrayal allowed Zionism to present itself as the only possible salvation. If the world came down to strong predators and weak victims, Zionism at least offered Jews the possibility of strength. But Zionism is ethno-nationalism. Like all ethno-nationalism, it required mass murder to clear the land to build its dream. On this haunted territory, oppressed became oppressor. 70-odd years after they stuck their state upon another people's ruin, the inheritors of Zion would liquidate their very own ghetto in Gaza, beside the sea. For ethno-nationalism, this is what winning means. So why did I write this book about the Bund, who lost, who were failed, and not about victorious killers? Because I am sick of monsters, whether they belong to my group or any other. Because I know we all have the capacity to be victims and tormentors, as well as bystanders, staring blankly at a burning wall. Because I want off the samsara wheel of atrocity, and the Bund's demand of solidarity across difference is the only way to get there. Such solidarity is fragile and frequently betrayed, but it is all we have. It is the only thing that can save us. There is no other earth, after all. We are trapped together on this one. It belongs to all of us, as inheritance and prison. It is Egypt and the Promised Land.